The C-130 Hercules transport plane descended through thick clouds, and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell gripped the armrest, watching Norfolk's coastline materialize below. She'd spent the last 8 years climbing the naval intelligence ladder, earning commendations, building an impeccable record. 3 deployments to hostile territories, 2 presidential briefings, a mind for signals intelligence that had earned her respect from every commanding officer she'd served under, until now. This assignment felt different, felt colder. As her boots touched the tarmac at Naval Station Norfolk, Sarah felt them before she saw them. The stairs. 40 fighter pilots stood in formation on the runway, their dress whites pristine, their expressions hardened. She was used to being the only woman in rooms full of men, but something about this particular gathering felt predatory. A tall pilot with slick-back hair caught her eye and smirked, whispering something to the man beside him. Laughter rippled through the formation. Captain Henderson, the squadron commander, offered a perfunctory handshake. "Welcome aboard, Lieutenant Commander. I'm sure you'll fit right in." The words were cordial, but his tone suggested otherwise. His eyes barely made contact with hers before he turned to address the men. "Let's show our new intelligence officer around the base." The tour was deliberately cold. While Henderson pointed out facilities and explained protocols, the pilots maintained a wall of silent hostility that Sarah could almost physically feel. At the barracks, a junior officer was assigned to help her settle into her quarters. He barely spoke, moving her gear with mechanical efficiency before disappearing without a word. Sarah's bunk was in a private officer's room, which she'd appreciated for about 2 hours. When she returned that evening around 1800 hours, she found the devastation. Every drawer had been emptied, her clothes scattered across the floor like trash. Her academy photos had been torn from the wall. Her personal laptop was overturned on the bed, and pinned directly to her pillow, written in crude block letters on a piece of official letterhead, was a handwritten note. "Get lost, new girl. This is a man's world." Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at those words. Not from fear. She'd faced far worse in her career, served in regions where insurgents targeted military personnel, where every mission carried the weight of potential death. This was different. This was intimate. This was deliberate psychological warfare from people who worked in the same building she did, people she was supposed to trust. She sat on her destroyed bunk, still in her dress uniform, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to feel the anger, the humiliation, the injustice of it all. 3 minutes to question why she'd fought so hard, sacrificed so much, only to be treated like an unwelcome intruder by men who'd never served a day in combat zones. 3 minutes to consider transferring, finding a different posting, somewhere that would appreciate her expertise. Then she stood up. Sarah methodically began gathering her scattered belongings, folding each piece of clothing carefully, replacing each photograph in its frame. She cleaned every surface, erased every sign that they'd violated her space. As she worked, something crystallized inside her, a cold, burning clarity that felt almost transcendent. They wanted to break her. They wanted her to quit, to transfer, to disappear quietly so the boys' club could remain undisturbed. They were about to discover they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Sarah had grown up in a military family. Her father was a Navy commander. Her mother had served as a surgeon in the Army. She'd been taught that quitting wasn't an option, that excellence was the only acceptable standard, that character was forged in moments exactly like this. She'd spent the last 15 years proving herself in an institution that hadn't made it easy, not because she was seeking validation from men but because she genuinely believed in service. She believed in the mission. She believed that women belonged in every role the military offered. But what these arrogant pilots didn't know, what almost nobody at Norfolk knew, was that Sarah carried a weapon far more powerful than her security clearance or her intelligence expertise. She was a black belt in Brazilian, trained since her teenage years by a legendary sensei who taught her that true discipline transcended physical combat. It was about mental fortitude, about understanding leverage, about recognizing how to take control of situations where opponents assumed dominance. She'd kept that part of her life private, compartmentalized, separate from her military career. Not because she was ashamed, but because she preferred to establish her reputation through her work, through her intellect, through her contributions to national security. Let them underestimate her. Let them assume she was just another desk jockey playing soldier. Let them believe she could be intimidated into submission. Sarah smiled coldly at her reflection in the barracks window as darkness fell over Norfolk. Oh, she thought, you have no idea what you've just awakened. This was only the beginning. Petty Officer First Class was the kind of man who'd coasted through life on charm and good looks, never developing the character to match his talent. He was objectively an excellent pilot. His combat record spoke to that. But his need to dominate extended far beyond the cockpit. He'd grown accustomed to being the alpha in every situation, the man other pilots deferred to, the golden boy that Captain Henderson favored with choice assignments. Sarah's arrival threatened his carefully constructed hierarchy. By the third day, it became clear that had declared war. During the morning intelligence briefing, Sarah presented her analysis on a potential terrorist cell operating near the Persian Gulf. She'd worked until 300 hours preparing the presentation, cross-referencing satellite imagery with signals intelligence, building a case that was methodical and airtight. She was halfway through her conclusions when interrupted loudly. So basically, you're saying you found some sand dunes and some radio signals. The room erupted in laughter. Officers who'd seemed respectful the day before suddenly avoided eye contact. Captain Henderson said nothing, simply continuing to sip his coffee as if the disruption was beneath his notice. Sarah's voice remained steady. Sir, the pattern analysis suggests. Suggests, leaned back in his chair, grinning at his audience like he'd just delivered the punchline to an excellent joke. That's intelligence speak for I'm guessing. Maybe stick to what you actually know. The briefing deteriorated from there. Every point she raised was met with dismissive comments or outright mockery. By the time she finished, the room had transformed from a professional military gathering into something that felt like a public execution. Sarah gathered her materials without showing emotion, but her hands wanted to shake. She'd briefed generals. She'd presented to the Joint Chiefs. She'd never been treated with such blatant disrespect in a professional setting. That afternoon, she discovered her access to the main intelligence server had been mysteriously revoked. When she contacted it, they claimed to have no record of her credentials being altered. When she approached Captain Henderson, he suggested she probably just forgot her password and didn't seem interested in investigating further. Sarah knew exactly what had happened, or one of his allies had leveraged access codes to sabotage her systems. But proving it would require internal investigations that depended on people who clearly didn't want to help her. The next morning, a physical print of her classified intelligence folder appeared on the break room bulletin board with "Unfit for Duty" written in aggressive red marker across its cover. Someone had stolen her restricted materials and desecrated them publicly. Sarah removed it immediately, her face burning with humiliation. 3 officers witnessed the incident. None of them said anything. By Friday of that first week, the harassment had evolved into something systematically orchestrated, had expanded his circle to include 3 other senior pilots, Lieutenant Ensign Pierce and a maintenance officer named Cooper. They functioned like a coordinated team with clear operational objectives. They'd delete her emails from shared servers. They'd accidentally schedule her for briefings in rooms that had been changed at the last minute, leaving her wandering the base. They'd leave crude drawings of female anatomy with her name written underneath on her car windshield. One morning, Sarah found her security clearance paperwork, classified documents that should never have left the secure facility, marked up with sexually explicit comments. The humiliation was calculated, deliberate, designed to make her feel like her body and her competence were equally unwelcome. She filed her first official complaint with the JAG office on day 8. The process was bureaucratic and glacially slow. Investigators seemed skeptical that such isolated incidents could constitute harassment. Captain Henderson was interviewed and suggested that Sarah was perhaps too sensitive for a combat-oriented environment. The investigation was closed without any corrective action taken. Sarah began eating meals alone in her quarters, working late into the night when the barracks were quiet, avoiding spaces where she might encounter and his crew. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. She'd survived insurgent attacks, interrogation resistance training, classified missions in hostile territories. But this slow, systematic destruction of her professional reputation and personal safety was beginning to wear on her in ways that combat never had. She needed an escape valve before she imploded completely. That Friday evening, Sarah drove downtown and discovered a nondescript gym called The Forge, tucked between a laundry service and a Vietnamese restaurant. The moment she stepped inside, something shifted. The walls were lined with heavy bags, speed bags, and rope stations. A boxing ring occupied the center of the warehouse-like space, and scattered throughout were people of every background, all focused intently on their training. No one looked at her with judgment. No one cared about her gender or rank or anything, except her dedication to the work. She paid for a month's membership and immediately changed into workout clothes. For the next 3 hours, Sarah trained with an intensity she'd never allowed herself in official military settings. Every punch was for smug face. Every kick was for Captain Henderson's indifference. Every drop of sweat was her refusing to break, refusing to let these men steal her future. She hit the heavy bag until her knuckles screamed. She ran intervals until her lungs burned. She pushed her body past the point where pain registered as anything except fuel. That's when she noticed him watching from the corner of the gym, a tall man with shoulder-length hair and a body covered in tactical scars. His frame was pure predatory muscle, his eyes intelligent and assessing. Chief Petty Officer, a SEAL, and something about the way he watched her suggested he recognized pain when he saw it, because he'd likely created his share of it. He didn't approach her that night, but she knew with absolute certainty that he would. Didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in patterns, in behavior analysis, in the subtle tells that separated predators from prey. He'd spent 22 years in the Navy SEAL teams reading people the way other men read books, and the woman attacking the heavy bag with methodical precision was broadcasting a specific story. She was a warrior in crisis. He'd recognized the signs immediately, the controlled rage, the perfect technique, the way she channeled anger into discipline rather than recklessness. Most people destroyed bags with wild emotion. This woman was calculating every strike, every rotation, every breath. She was someone trained in combat fundamentals, someone who understood that strength without control was just noise. Had his own reasons for recognizing pain. He'd grown up poor in South Central Los Angeles, the son of a black mother and a white father in a neighborhood that didn't know what to do with mixed-race kids. He joined the Navy at 18 specifically to escape, to prove something to every person who'd ever doubted him. The SEAL teams had been a different kind of war, not against external enemies, but against institutional racism that ran deeper than any tactical challenge. He'd had to be twice as good, work twice as hard, survive twice the scrutiny. And he had. Now at 43, he was one of the most decorated SEALs in active service, a chief petty officer with a reputation for uncompromising integrity. He recognized that same, relentless determination in Sarah Mitchell. Waited until she'd finished her session, until she'd showered and was preparing to leave the gym. He approached her with the same deliberate calm he used when de-escalating volatile tactical situations. "You ever consider competitive fighting?" His voice was quiet, non-threatening, genuinely curious. Sarah's defensive walls shot up instantly. Her hand instinctively moved toward her bag, her entire body language screaming that she didn't want conversation, didn't want to be approached, didn't want anything from a stranger in a gym. Understood the response. When you were under siege, You assumed every unfamiliar person was a potential threat. I'm fine, she said curtly, moving toward the exit. Not suggesting you're not, said, not following but making his voice carry. Just observing that you've got advanced training. Brazilian, maybe. Black belt level from your stance work. Sarah stopped. She turned back slowly, reassessing him. He wasn't hitting on her, wasn't being aggressive or inappropriate, was simply making an accurate observation about her skill level. Who are you? She asked carefully. Chief Petty Officer, SEAL Team 4. He kept his hands visible and non-threatening. And I'm not trying to complicate your life. I'm just saying I recognize something when I see it. Over the next week, they developed a pattern. Sarah would arrive at the gym around 1900 hours, would be there, working through his own training routine. They began spotting each other on weights, sharing water breaks, engaging in brief conversations that felt more like mutual recognition than actual friendship. Never asked about her situation directly. He simply shared pieces of his own story. On the 8th evening, while they were wrapping hand tape, finally opened up. I made it through the SEAL teams because I refused to quit, he said quietly, focusing on his hands rather than looking at her. But it wasn't because I was the strongest or the fastest. It was because I was angrier than everyone else, angrier at the system, angrier at the people who thought I didn't belong, angrier at myself for doubting sometimes. He finished tapping his left hand and flexed it slowly. Took me years to understand that anger is fuel, not a weapon. You channel it right, it becomes unstoppable. You channel it wrong, it destroys you from the inside. Sarah listened without responding immediately. Something about honesty created space for her own. They're trying to force me out, she finally admitted. The fighter squadron. They want me to quit, to transfer, to disappear so they can pretend I never existed. Nodded slowly like he'd suspected as much. Let me teach you something, he said. Not fighting techniques, you've already got those. I mean how to survive institutional warfare, how to use their own systems against them, how to project such unshakable confidence that they start questioning whether they're actually winning. Over the following 3 weeks, became Sarah's strategic mentor. He taught her advanced combat psychology, how to read threats accurately, how to distinguish between genuine danger and performance intimidation, how to project authority through body language and voice control. More importantly, he taught her that the real war wasn't physical. It was psychological. It was about refusing to internalize their narratives about who she was supposed to be. The only way out, he told her one evening after an especially brutal day at the base, is through. You don't run, you don't hide. You become so damn good, so undeniably competent that they can't ignore you anymore. You make your excellence impossible to dismiss. But the real breakthrough came one night when Sarah broke down completely. She'd been publicly humiliated during a mission briefing, had interrupted her twice, mocked her analysis, and Captain Henderson had sided with him. By the time she made it to the gym, she was barely holding it together. Found her sitting in his truck in the parking lot, tears streaming down her face. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply sat beside her in silence, holding her hand while she cried out months of accumulated pain and humiliation. You're the strongest person I know, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. And I'm going to help you survive this. Not because you need saving, you don't, but because warriors don't fight alone. That's not weakness, that's strategy. For the first time since arriving at Norfolk, Sarah didn't feel completely isolated. She had someone who understood, truly understood, the price of refusing to surrender. The joint training exercise was scheduled for 600 hours on a Tuesday morning in late September. Admiral James Blackwood himself would be observing, a man with the power to make or break careers with a single recommendation. The exercise was designed to test tactical decision-making, strategic analysis, and real-time intelligence processing under pressure. For Sarah, it represented everything. Her chance to prove beyond any doubt that she belonged in the fighter squadron, that her expertise was indispensable, that the pilots depended on her intelligence more than she depended on their validation. Prepared obsessively. Every night for 2 weeks, she'd remained in the intelligence office until 2300 hours, cross-referencing data, building redundant verification systems for her analysis, creating backup plans for her backup plans. She'd memorized every possible variable, every contingency, every potential scenario that Admiral Blackwood might throw at them. Her presentation would be flawless. Her intelligence would be accurate. Her recommendations would be strategically sound. Sarah had no idea that had been preparing too. The night before the exercise, and his 3 closest allies, Pierce and Cooper, convened in the barracks after hours. They gathered in the secure intelligence office using access codes that Cooper possessed through his maintenance position. What happened next was deliberate sabotage. They pulled Sarah's prepared intelligence files from the secure server. They didn't delete them. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they carefully, methodically altered them. Coordinates were shifted by precise degrees, enough to throw off tactical calculations but not enough to be immediately obvious. Target designations were switched. Enemy force estimates were inflated dramatically. Crucial timing information for air support was manipulated to create conflicts with ground operations. The false data was woven throughout the legitimate intelligence with surgical precision. They left her files exactly where they should be, looking exactly as they should look, but poisoned from the inside out. The exercise began at dawn. Sarah stood in the command center with Admiral Blackwood observing from a raised platform, flanked by Captain Henderson and senior officers from the fleet. 40 pilots in the simulators awaited her intelligence briefing. This was her moment. This was everything she'd worked toward since arriving at Norfolk. She began delivering her analysis with confidence, unaware that every recommendation she made was based on deliberately data. The pilots acknowledged her intelligence and began executing their tactical maneuvers accordingly. For the first 30 seconds, everything proceeded smoothly. Then the simulated enemy forces responded in ways that made no tactical sense given Sarah's intelligence estimates. The enemy appeared in locations where she'd indicated there would be minimal resistance. Their force strength was triple what she'd reported. Their weapons systems matched none of her projections. The pilots, following her guidance, flew directly into a simulated ambush. Within 90 seconds, half the squadron was destroyed in the simulation. Sarah's eyes went wide as she realized something was catastrophically wrong. She frantically began reviewing her intelligence files, her hands shaking as she scrolled through data that suddenly looked fundamentally corrupted. But there was no time to troubleshoot. The exercise was unfolding in real time. Admiral Blackwood was watching, and the pilots, the same pilots who'd mocked her for weeks, were now dying based on her intelligence analysis. The exercise ended in complete tactical failure. As the pilots emerged from the simulators, their expressions ranged from confused to furious. They'd lost. They'd failed spectacularly in front of the Admiral, and the finger of blame pointed directly at Sarah's intelligence briefing. Admiral Blackwood descended from his observation platform with a grim expression, moving directly toward her. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, your intelligence analysis was fundamentally flawed," he said coldly, his voice carrying across the entire command center. "You provided data that led directly to simulated casualties among your own forces. In a real combat scenario, you would have killed these pilots." The words landed like physical blows. Sarah's face burned with humiliation as every officer in the room absorbed the criticism. Captain Henderson looked disappointed, like he'd suspected all along that she wasn't qualified. The pilots looked betrayed, like they'd trusted her and she'd failed them catastrophically. Sarah wanted to argue, to demand that her files be examined for tampering, to accuse directly, but she had no proof. The corrupted files were indistinguishable from legitimate errors in her analysis. How could she prove sabotage without evidence? She'd look paranoid, unreliable, someone making excuses for her own incompetence. Admiral Blackwood turned and left without another word. That evening, as Sarah drove back to the barracks in darkness, her mind was fragmenting. Everything she'd worked for was crumbling. Her reputation was in tatters. She could already hear the whispers. The new girl couldn't handle the pressure. Intelligence officer who doesn't know how to verify her own data. Woman in a position above her capability level. She was so absorbed in her spiraling thoughts that she barely noticed the 4 figures standing in the parking lot as she pulled in. Pierce and Cooper were waiting near her car. No other officers were visible. The parking area was isolated, poorly lit, perfect for what they were clearly planning. "Hey, Commander," called out, his voice dripping with mock respect. "Heard you had a rough day." Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her keys, analyzing the situation with the combat awareness had taught her. She was outnumbered 4-1. They were positioned to block her path to the barracks. Their body language was aggressive and coordinated, suggesting this wasn't a random encounter but a calculated intimidation tactic. "You don't belong here," Pierce said, stepping forward to physically block her escape route. "You never did. Maybe you should take the Admiral's advice and find a job that matches your actual skill level." "Back off," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She could handle one of them in hand-to-hand combat, maybe 2, but 4 coordinated opponents was a different calculus, even with her training. Moved closer, his face inches from hers. "We're done with you. This is a man's game. Either transfer out voluntarily or we'll make sure." The sharp sound of a truck door slamming cut through the night. Emerged from the darkness like a predatory animal, his presence so commanding that all 4 men immediately froze. He didn't run, didn't shout, simply walked toward them with the casual confidence of someone who'd killed people in actual combat zones and found civilian intimidation tactics quaint. "Walk away," said quietly. "Right now, all of you." For a moment, the 4 pilots considered fighting back. Then they looked into his eyes and recognized something ancient and dangerous. They dispersed into the darkness without another word, leaving Sarah standing alone with her warrior. Didn't say anything either. He simply put his arm around her shoulders and walked her to her quarters, sitting with her through the entire night while she processed the magnitude of what had happened. By morning, everything would change. But for now, in the darkness of her barracks room, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that she wasn't completely alone, made 3 phone calls from Sarah's barracks room while she sat in stunned silence, staring at nothing. The first was to his commanding officer, Captain Richard Torres, a man had served within actual combat operations and trusted implicitly. The second was to the Naval Investigative Service. The third was to a JAG officer he knew personally who specialized in harassment cases. By 800 hours the next morning, the machinery of official military investigation had been set in motion. Sarah was called into a formal interview with NIS agents at 1000 hours. She described the parking lot incident in clinical detail, the 4 men, their positions, their threats, the clear intent to intimidate her into transferring. She provided timestamps and locations. She explained the pattern of harassment that preceded it, and she described, for the first time to official investigators, the sabotaged intelligence files from the training exercise. "You believe Petty Officer deliberately corrupted your intelligence data?" The lead investigator, Special Agent, asked carefully. "I don't believe it," Sarah said quietly. "I know it. The alterations are too precise, too coordinated, too surgically placed to be accidental. An intelligence analyst doesn't accidentally shift coordinates by exactly 5 degrees in every critical location. That's not human error. That's deliberate manipulation by someone with access codes and technical knowledge." Agent exchanged a glance with her partner. This case was expanding well beyond a simple harassment complaint. This was potentially sabotage of classified intelligence systems. This was a federal crime. The investigation that followed was thorough and merciless. Investigators examined server logs and discovered that Cooper's maintenance access codes had been used to alter Sarah's files. They interviewed pilots who'd participated in the training exercise and heard consistent testimony about unusual intelligence inconsistencies. They pulled security footage from the parking lot and captured crystal-clear video of and his allies blocking Sarah's path, their aggressive body language, their threatening gestures, all documented with timestamp precision. But Pierce and Cooper weren't stupid. They'd prepared their defense. Within 48 hours, they filed counter-allegations against Sarah. The accusations were vicious and calculated to destroy her credibility. They claimed she'd initiated the parking lot confrontation aggressively, that she'd threatened them with violence, that she'd deliberately provided false intelligence to frame them for sabotage. They produced witnesses, junior enlisted sailors who'd been coached to testify that they'd heard Sarah making aggressive statements about taking down the fighter squadron. They argued that her black belt training made her a danger to the unit, that she'd been the aggressor in every situation. One fabricated story claimed that Sarah had threatened with physical violence if he didn't stop, interfering with her career advancement. Another alleged that she'd told Pierce she knew martial arts techniques that could kill a man in seconds, and had used that knowledge to intimidate them. Sarah's world collapsed in real time. Suddenly, she wasn't the victim of harassment. She was a potentially unstable officer with undisclosed combat training who'd allegedly threatened multiple pilots. Captain Henderson, facing pressure from above about the investigation, began treating her with visible suspicion. Officers who'd seemed neutral now avoided her in the corridors. The narrative had shifted from woman being bullied by pilots to volatile woman making false accusations to cover her own sabotage. Wanted to go to war. He showed up at Sarah's quarters one evening, radiating barely controlled fury. "We need to file counter-charges," he said immediately. "Conspiracy, filing false reports, obstruction of justice. We have video evidence. We have server logs. We can destroy them in court." Sarah shook her head slowly. "We have evidence that they altered files and that they confronted me in the parking lot. But their lawyers will argue the intelligence alterations were collaborative mistakes, and the parking lot encounter could be interpreted either way depending on who testifies. They've built a narrative where I'm the aggressor, and my black belt training, which should never have been relevant, suddenly makes me look like I was threatening them. So what, we just let them win?" His voice was raw with anger. "No," Sarah said quietly, "but we have to let the system work. If we push too hard, if we look desperate, it plays into their narrative that I'm unstable. We document everything. We let investigators do their jobs. We trust that truth eventually prevails." His jaw clenched. He wanted to fight, that was his nature. But he understood that Sarah was right. In the court of military justice, perception mattered as much as evidence. And right now, their perception was being shaped by a coordinated disinformation campaign. The investigation stalled. NIS investigators seemed frustrated by the conflicting testimony and the lack of clear-cut evidence that definitively proved sabotage versus collaborative error. Captain Henderson suggested that perhaps both parties shared responsibility for the communication breakdown. The JAG officer warned Sarah that if counter-charges went forward, her career could be permanently damaged. Sarah spent the next 3 weeks in a psychological nightmare. She couldn't sleep. She'd lie awake reviewing every conversation, every interaction, terrified that some casual comment she'd made might be reinterpreted as threatening. She couldn't eat. Food turned to ash in her mouth. She'd lost 12 pounds by week 2. She began questioning her own perceptions. Had she been too aggressive in the parking lot? Had her body language been threatening? Was she actually the problem? Found her one night sitting on the floor of her barracks room at 300 hours, staring at nothing. "The evidence will speak," he told her, pulling her against his chest. "I know the system is broken. I know it moves slowly. I know it feels like they're winning. But we're going to present the truth, and the truth is going to matter." Sarah wanted to believe him, but as days turned into weeks with no movement in the investigation, she began to wonder if faith in the system was simply the luxury of a man who'd never been systematically hunted by an institution he devoted his life to serving. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was about the pace of justice. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, exactly 3 weeks after the parking lot incident. Special agent called Sarah into a secure conference room and slid a USB drive across the table. "We found something," said, her expression unreadable. "Security footage from the parking lot. High definition, time-stamped, completely clear, but that's not the important part." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the video file on the secure computer. The footage was exactly as she remembered, and his allies blocking her path, their aggressive positioning, their threatening gestures. But was right. That wasn't the breakthrough. "Watch the audio analysis," said, clicking to a secondary file. The sound engineers had enhanced the parking lot audio using advanced military technology. Despite the ambient noise of the bass, they'd isolated specific phrases spoken by and the others. The conversation was damning. "You need to transfer out. Make sure you're gone by Christmas. The Admiral already thinks you're incompetent." There it was, documented proof of coordinated intimidation. Their own words, captured by technology they hadn't known existed, condemning them absolutely. But wasn't finished. "There's more," she said, pulling up another file. "We examined the server logs more carefully. Your intelligence files were accessed using Cooper's maintenance codes, but we traced the actual alterations to a specific terminal in the pilot's lounge. We pulled facial recognition data from that terminal's security camera and matched it to Lieutenant. He made those alterations deliberately, methodically, with clear intent to corrupt your analysis." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, the first genuine moment of hope in 3 weeks. "We also discovered something interesting about counter-allegations," continued. "Those witnesses he produced, we interviewed them separately. 2 of them admitted they were coached by and to fabricate testimony. One junior sailor broke down during questioning and provided a signed statement detailing how he was threatened with negative performance reviews if he didn't corroborate the false narrative." The investigation that had seemed stalled suddenly accelerated with terrifying velocity. Within 72 hours, NIS investigators conducted formal interviews with everyone involved. The momentum had shifted irrevocably, and his allies realized they were in actual legal jeopardy, not just career-ending consequences, but potential federal charges for obstruction of justice, filing false military reports, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. Their legal defense crumbled almost immediately. Cooper requested immunity in exchange for testimony about how had coordinated the intelligence sabotage. Pierce negotiated a plea agreement. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of his co-conspirators, confessed to deliberately altering Sarah's intelligence files with the specific intent to embarrass her during Admiral Blackwood's observation. But the most explosive testimony came from an entirely unexpected source. Petty Officer 3rd Class David, a junior enlisted sailor whom had bullied relentlessly for months, finally found his courage. Had been one of the fabricated witnesses initially, but he'd broken during his interview with NIS. Now he came forward voluntarily with a devastating detailed statement about months of systematic harassment, not just targeting Sarah, but targeting any junior officer or enlisted sailor who didn't immediately defer to authority. His testimony painted a picture of predatory behavior that extended far beyond one woman, had created a culture of fear and intimidation throughout the squadron. He'd blocked promotions for pilots who questioned his authority. He'd sabotaged the careers of officers who'd challenged his decisions. And he'd specifically targeted Sarah as a threat because her intelligence expertise meant the pilots would have to listen to her rather than automatically accepting his tactical recommendations. He couldn't stand that. his voice steady despite visible nervousness. Couldn't stand that there was someone in the room who had authority he couldn't control or intimidate, so he decided to destroy her credibility before she could become a threat. The investigation's official conclusion was devastating for and his allies. They'd violated multiple military conduct codes. They'd compromised classified intelligence systems. They'd filed false reports with federal investigators. They'd created a hostile work environment with clear intent to force a commissioned officer to transfer. Faced demotion from E5 to E3, loss of flight status, and potential discharge from the Navy. Faced similar consequences plus criminal charges for tampering with classified systems. Pierce and Cooper's fates were less severe, but still career-ending. The command itself faced serious scrutiny. Captain Henderson came under investigation for failing to address a known harassment problem. Admiral Blackwood's office launched a comprehensive review of command culture and leadership failures. The entire squadron suddenly became the focus of institutional reckoning. Sat with Sarah in a secure conference room as they reviewed the final investigation report. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with satisfaction. "You were right," he said quietly, "about letting the system work, about not pushing too hard. I wanted to burn it all down. You understood that sometimes patience is the most powerful weapon." Sarah read through the findings slowly, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. She'd been vindicated completely. Her intelligence analysis had been sound. Her accusations had been proven true beyond any reasonable doubt. The men who tried to destroy her were facing the consequences of their actions. But the victory tasted complicated. Yes, justice had prevailed. Yes, the truth had emerged. But only because advanced surveillance technology existed, because special agent had been thorough, because petty officer had found courage, because had reported the incident immediately. What if any one of those variables had been different? What if had been smarter about covering his tracks? What if no one had believed her? "There's something you need to understand," said, reading her expression. "The system didn't fail you because it's inherently broken. It failed you because individual people, Henderson, the initial investigators, the witnesses, chose not to intervene. But there are also good people in the system. People like Tors. People who, when given evidence and pressure, will do the right thing." Sarah nodded slowly. It was a fragile truth that institutions were only as ethical as the individuals within them, but it was truth nonetheless. Within 48 hours, she received official notification that her security clearance had been fully restored, her record cleared of any negative marks, and her standing within naval intelligence completely rehabilitated. Captain Henderson was reassigned pending further investigation. The fighter squadron was placed under enhanced command oversight. Sarah had survived, and in surviving she'd changed her entire command. 2 weeks after the investigation concluded, Sarah received a formal offer from Naval Personnel Command, transfer to any squadron in the United States Navy. No questions asked. Full choice of location and assignment. It was a golden ticket, a way out of Norfolk, a fresh start, a complete escape from the trauma of the past 3 months. She turned it down. "Are you insane?" asked when she told him her decision. They were at the Forge gym wrapping up an evening training session. "You can go anywhere, you've earned it. Why would you stay?" "Because leaving looks like running," Sarah said, tapping her wrists methodically. "Because if I transfer, it becomes a win for them. They wanted me gone, and I'd be confirming that their harassment strategy worked. And because I didn't fight this hard just to surrender the battlefield." Studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "You're going to be dangerous," he said quietly, "in the best possible way." The remaining fighter squadron pilots received mandatory cultural training and harassment prevention seminars. Initially, the atmosphere remained tense and resentful, but Sarah refused to allow bitterness to fester. She scheduled one-on-one meetings with each pilot who'd participated in the harassment, not to forgive them, but to establish clear expectations moving forward. "I'm not interested in your apologies," she told them directly. "What I'm interested in is your professional behavior. I'm staying in this squadron. You're staying in this squadron. We're going to work together and we're going to do it with mutual respect. That's not negotiable." Some pilots resisted initially, viewing her continued presence as an affront. But Sarah's response was to become systematically, undeniably indispensable. During the next major intelligence operation, a sophisticated signals analysis mission targeting a suspected terrorist financing network, Sarah cracked a series of encrypted communications that had stumped the broader intelligence community for 6 months. Her analysis identified 3 previously unknown operatives, traced a financial pipeline through 7 countries, and provided intelligence that led to international coordinated arrests. The operation was classified, but word spread through the squadron nonetheless. The pilots who'd mocked her intelligence expertise suddenly found themselves dependent on her analysis for every tactical decision. 3 months after the investigation concluded, Sarah established the fighter squadron's first formal mentorship program. She partnered junior enlisted sailors with senior officers, creating structured relationships designed to prevent exactly the kind of predatory hierarchy that had cultivated. She created peer accountability systems, anonymous reporting mechanisms for harassment, and regular forums where junior personnel could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Captain Henderson was reassigned. His replacement, Captain Lisa, was a former pilot with zero tolerance for toxic culture. She and Sarah worked together to implement systemic changes that transformed the squadron's operational environment. Within 6 months, morale surveys showed dramatic improvement in unit cohesion and workplace safety. The pilots who'd initially resented Sarah gradually came to respect her, not because she was a woman. That had never been the real issue. They respected her because she was brilliant at her job, because she refused to compromise her standards, and because she'd chosen to stay and fight rather than disappear quietly. During a critical naval operation in the Persian Gulf, a pilot named Lieutenant James, no relation to the NIS investigator, made a tactical error that could have resulted in friendly casualties. Sarah caught the mistake in his approach vector during pre-flight intelligence briefing and corrected it. The correction prevented what would have been a catastrophic friendly fire incident. Afterward approached her privately. "Thank you," he said simply. "I didn't respect you before, but I do now. I respect anyone willing to stand by their principles even when it costs them everything." By month 6, Sarah wasn't just accepted in the squadron. She was essential to its operations. Pilots requested her personal briefings before missions. Junior officers asked her for career advice. The culture had fundamentally shifted from hostile exclusion to genuine collaboration. Step back from his protective role during this period. Sarah no longer needed defending. She'd proven capable of defending herself and others. But their friendship deepened into something more substantial. They were training partners and confidants, 2 warriors who'd survived institutional warfare and emerged stronger. One evening, after an especially brutal training session, asked Sarah a question that had clearly been weighing on him. "Do you regret staying?" he asked. "Do you regret choosing Norfolk instead of transferring?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret that it happened," she said finally. "I regret that I had to fight this hard just to be treated fairly. I regret the trauma and the sleepless nights and the weeks where I questioned whether my entire career had been a mistake." She paused, looking at him directly. "But I don't regret staying, because staying meant I could change things. Staying meant I didn't let them win. And staying meant I got to prove something not just to myself, but to every junior officer in this squadron who was watching to see if I'd break." Nodded slowly, understanding the profound truth in those words. They'd become equals through adversity, 2 people who'd refused to surrender, who'd fought through institutional indifference, who'd emerged not just surviving but transforming the very systems that had tried to destroy them. 9 months after the investigation concluded, Sarah received notification of her promotion to commander. The ceremony was held in the same auditorium where she'd been publicly humiliated during the failed training exercise. This time, when she received her new insignia, the entire squadron erupted in genuine, sustained applause. Captain smiled at her from the front row. Admiral Blackwood, who'd been initially skeptical of Sarah's competence, watched with an expression that suggested he'd learned an important lesson about assumptions and prejudice. But it was presence in the audience that meant the most. He'd stepped back from his mentoring role, allowed her to reclaim her power fully, but he was still there, bearing witness to her triumph, honoring her journey, standing as proof that some people chose to see others clearly even when the world insisted on blindness. Sarah had arrived at Norfolk as the new girl they wanted to destroy. She was leaving as the woman who'd refused to break, and in doing so, had transformed an entire command. The promotion ceremony happened on a perfect spring morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah arrived at Naval Station Norfolk. The auditorium was packed with officers, enlisted personnel, and dignitaries. Admiral Blackwood himself stood ready to present the new commander's insignia. As Sarah walked forward in her dress whites, the entire squadron rose to their feet, not because protocol required it, but because they wanted to honor her. Admiral Blackwood's expression was thoughtful as he extended his hand. "Commander Mitchell, your service to this squadron and to the Navy has been exemplary. Your intelligence analysis has prevented casualties and saved lives. Your leadership has transformed our command culture. It's my honor to recognize your promotion." As he pinned the insignia on her collar, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause. Sarah's eyes found in the audience, and he nodded, a gesture of profound respect between equals who'd walked through fire together. That evening, as the sun descended over the Atlantic, Sarah stood on the pier at Naval Station Norfolk, watching the water transform from blue to gold. They'd both requested the evening off. They both knew this moment mattered in ways that went beyond the promotion itself. "You never needed me to save you," said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. "I realized that somewhere around month 4 when you started implementing those mentorship programs. You were already saving yourself." Sarah smiled, understanding the profound truth in those words. "No," she said slowly, "but I needed you to stand beside me while I saved myself. That's something entirely different. That's everything." Had received his own notification that day. He'd been selected to lead a special operations team deploying to Southeast Asia, a position that would have been to him years ago due to the same institutional racism Sarah had faced. His career had been transformed alongside hers, both of them rising because they refused to accept the narrative that they didn't belong. "I deploy in 2 weeks," said. 6-month rotation, possibly extended depending on operational requirements. "I know," Sarah replied. She'd been aware of his deployment timeline for weeks. They'd both understood that their paths would eventually diverge. That was the nature of military service. Relationships existed in the spaces between deployments, in the moments stolen from institutional demands. "Will you be here when I get back?" asked, the vulnerability in his voice surprising for a man who'd spent 2 decades perfecting emotional control. "I'm being reassigned to Naval Intelligence Command Headquarters in D.C., Sarah said. "Directorate position, policy development and institutional reform. They're specifically asking me to lead the military's response to workplace harassment and toxic culture issues." Absorbed the information without visible reaction, but Sarah saw the shift in his eyes, pride in something that looked like love, though neither of them had spoken that word yet. "So you're going to change the entire institution," he said finally. "I'm going to try," Sarah replied, "one command at a time, starting with the lessons I learned here." They stood in silence for a long time, watching the sun finish its descent below the horizon. Two warriors, forged in the same fire, standing together in the liminal space between their separate futures. "Do you remember the night we met?" asked, "at the gym? You asked if I'd ever considered competitive fighting," Sarah said. "I was asking if you'd considered fighting back," corrected. "Not just physically, against the entire system that was trying to crush you. I saw something in you that night, a refusal to surrender that reminded me of myself. I thought maybe you needed someone to fight alongside you." "I did," Sarah said. "And you did. But more than that, you believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. You showed me that the system could work if enough good people refused to accept injustice." Pulled her close, and they stood watching the stars emerge over the water. Tomorrow, Norfolk would feel different. Sarah would pack her belongings and prepare for her new assignment in D.C., would finalize his deployment briefings and prepare to lead warriors in operations she'd never fully understand. Their daily presence in each other's lives would end. But something deeper had been forged between them, something that transcended proximity and time. They'd walked through institutional warfare together. They'd survived sabotage and false accusations and systematic dehumanization. They'd emerged not broken, but transformed. "I want you to know something," Sarah said, pulling back to look at him directly. "Every time you felt like giving up on the system, every time you wanted to burn it down, I understood. But you taught me patience. You taught me that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the refusal to surrender your integrity while fighting for change. That's going to shape everything I do in D.C." Kissed her forehead. "And you taught me that strength isn't just about physical power or combat prowess. It's about standing in your truth even when the entire world insists you're lying. That's going to shape every decision I make leading my team." They walked back toward the base hand in hand, two people whose romantic relationship might never progress beyond this, because military service had a way of demanding sacrifice. But their connection had transcended romance into something more substantial. They were witnesses to each other's transformation. They were proof that institutional change was possible when people refused to accept injustice. 2 weeks later, deployed to Southeast Asia carrying with him the memory of Sarah standing on the pier, watching him leave, her expression resolute and unbroken. 1 week after that, Sarah packed her car and drove north toward Washington, D.C., where she would spend the next 5 years systematically implementing the lessons she'd learned at Norfolk, transforming military culture from the inside out, one command at a time. The story of Sarah Mitchell and became something of a legend within military circles. How a new officer had been systematically bullied, how a SEAL had stood beside her, how they'd both emerged not broken, but transformed, how they'd used their experience to change an entire institution. Years later, when junior officers faced harassment or discrimination, they would hear Sarah's story. When enlisted sailors felt isolated and hopeless, they would learn about commitment to institutional integrity. And they would understand that change was possible, not easily, not quickly, but inevitably, if enough people refused to surrender their principles. Sarah never forgot the day she arrived at Norfolk as the new girl they wanted to destroy. But she also never forgot the moment she realized that refusing to break didn't mean enduring alone. It meant finding warriors who understood the cost of integrity and standing together while the institution transformed around you. By the time returned from his deployment 18 months later, Sarah had already implemented comprehensive harassment prevention protocols across 3 major naval commands. She was being considered for a senior Pentagon position that would give her influence over military-wide policy. They met at the Forge Gym on a Tuesday evening, exactly as they had so many times before. Nothing had changed between them. Everything had changed in the world around them. "Still the strongest person I know," said, watching her work a heavy bag with the same controlled intensity that had first caught his attention years ago. "Still the warrior who taught me how to survive," Sarah replied, turning to smile at him. Their story had become more than a personal narrative. It had become a testament to what happens when good people refuse to accept institutional injustice, when warriors stand beside each other, when excellence and integrity prove stronger than predatory systems. Sarah had gotten lost once, not in place but in doubt, in the belief that the system might be too broken to fix, that she might be too weak to survive, that fighting back might cost more than surrender. But had shown her the way home. And together, they changed everything. The end.